Thank you for tuning in. We have the pleasure to welcome in our studios today Will Fitzgibbon. He's a reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalism who conducted the investigation on the Panama Papers. Prior to that, he was a reporter on ICIJ's Swiss Leaks project and heads ICIJ's Africa desk, coordinating and expanding ICIJ's collaboration with journalists across Africa. Before coming to Washington, he worked at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in London, where his work on politics, the finance industry, and housing appeared in The Guardian and in The Observer. He studied at the London School of Economics, Sciences Po Paris, and the Australian National University. Thank you for being with us, Will.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
In Lebanon, actually, as well. We're going to talk about one of the main reasons you were here was because of the Free Connected Minds Conference, which May Chidiac hosts every year. It's a specific conference for journalism, and you were there to talk about the Panama Papers and how that whole thing started. And I remember, I was talking to you a bit about this before the interview. I was reading about, what took me aback a little bit was the whole coordination effort that was made during the investigation on the Panama Papers, and how everybody coordinated so well and nothing leaked. So tell me a bit about that.
Well, you're right. It was and remains still something that I still surprise myself with. Basically, ICIJ has worked on a number of leak projects now, and our modus operandi, if you like, is to persuade journalists that the future of journalism and the way that they can have more impact in their storytelling is working together and publishing together rather than telling one-off stories at a time, which is pretty counterintuitive to lots of journalists. Ours is a profession that is sometimes inherently individualistic, and we're used to investigative journalists working in dark back rooms, smoking cigarettes and publishing exclusive scoops.
It sounds like such a spy-ish kind of thing. It's all dark and it's all, but we'll get to that. It is and it isn't in a way, because Gerard Ryle, the head of the ICIJ, said that what the work does specifically is give ground to journalism, and it gives meaning to journalism and the way that investigative journalism works. So what has been, while you were doing this whole project, what was the thing that struck you the most?
The thing that struck me most about Panama Papers was how much this project motivated and spoke to hundreds of journalists from every corner of the globe.
Why do you think that is?
I think that's because the notion or the understanding that many people have, even if it's just something in the back of their minds, that the offshore system, which is by its nature a secretive reserve of elites and power brokers, is in some ways inherently unfair. So I think whether or not you're a journalist from West Africa, Lebanon, Japan, or the United States, it's therefore something that you're intrigued to learn more about, and we hope to help reform in some ways.
It's been labeled the biggest leak in history, 11.5 million files. I have a bit of information here: 4.8 million emails, 3 million database files, 2.1 million spreadsheets from the law firm Mossack Fonseca, am I saying that right, in Panama, that had reportedly created shell companies that its clients have used to hide their assets. And, this offshore holdings operations, this wasn't new. You've worked on this before. You had worked on the Swiss leaks. Was this any different? Just in terms of its magnitude?
It was different in terms of its magnitude, certainly, and I think that was the most striking thing. We're talking not only about 1.5 million files, but countries as small as Rwanda to as big as Russia and China. So what Panama Papers did was show the world, those who knew about the problem and those who didn't, that this really was something that wasn't just a part of the world, but a central part of the world, whether we know it or not.
You talked about, it did also kind of put to light, what over 140 politicians and public officials and sports figures, what they were doing. But at the same time, there's been a lot of controversy surrounding them because you did not leak every detail. Why not?
The decision of ICIJ and the 400 journalists who worked with us on the project was that there was legitimate private information within the Panama Papers that had no reason to be in the public domain. Things like passports and details of minors, perhaps banking details, financial transactions about individuals for whom no stories had been written, therefore no context or suspicion of even any wrongdoing was done.
Right, but then why expose people like Russian President Vladimir Putin, China's Xi Jinping, the Saudi king, dealings by the late father of then Prime Minister David Cameron? I mean, you know, you can understand why some people would be like, well, if they're going to expose some, then why not expose everybody?
Well, I think if you're a politician, be it elected or not, you are in a class of your own when it comes to accountability and transparency. And that's not something that ICIJ and our members have decided. That's something that the vast majority of citizens believe when they vote. That's something that politicians themselves believe when they introduce laws that require asset declarations of politicians. So in some ways, those were the easiest stories to tell, because if you're a politician, and especially if you haven't disclosed what you've been doing offshore, then this is something that your citizens and the world at large should know about.
I think the thing that was the most disturbing for people is that many of the leaders exposed tend to have very anti-corruption, try to take very anti-corruption measures in their own countries. So there was probably a lot of hypocrisy there reported, and I think that's probably what struck most, was that like the angle that, so how do you get all these leaks, you're studying them for about a year and a half. How do you decide what angle to take? Because as a journalist, when you decide what angle to take, there is bias that kind of comes in there, doesn't it?
Well, there are certainly choices made from the very beginning. You're right. When the easy ones, the low-hanging fruit, as I referred to earlier, probably were those politicians, because these are people in whom the public has placed trust. You were correct that the hypocrisy in a number of cases really shocked us when we saw politicians in Europe, in Northern Europe, who in some cases had come to power on platforms of transparency, were also found to have been involved in undeclared offshore companies. That was even more outrageous in the public mind than your run-of-the-mill politician. And I think what Panama Papers was also really important to showcase was that corruption, tax evasion, and financial secrecy isn't something that just belongs to third world African dictatorships and underdeveloped corrupt countries. What I really found,
everybody's involved.
Sure.
Not everybody, but
and
almost.
London, Zurich, Geneva, and New York City and Miami are some of the prime hotspots of this corrupt offshore system.
Were you able to reveal a lot about what was going on in the United States in terms of tax evasion? So did you get Trump's taxes? Are you still working on that? Is anything there?
We didn't, not in the Panama Papers. Remember that Panama Papers, as you said, comes from one particular law firm.
Right.
And we know that that law firm, in its own books, only had 1 or 1 point something
right,
percent
but as you continue
customers.
leaks and just generally projects about tax havens and whatnot, generally, is the United States part of that investigation?
Oh, absolutely. I think all journalists.
What have you revealed?
ICIJ,
What have you revealed recently? What has the ICIJ revealed about the United States, for example?
About the United States? In Panama Papers, there were American fraudsters and citizens who were involved. That's certainly true. And we know now that the IRS and multiple arms of the US administration are actively investigating Panama Papers. Previous investigations have focused more on corporate tax avoidance and corporate tax malfeasance, if you like, because I think we don't always want to just focus on individuals and naming and shaming. At an individual level, companies are also one of the biggest.
When you talk about the IRS and you say, they're probably getting a lot of the info from the Panama Papers, isn't this work that the IRS does on its own as well, that kind of investigative work in order to see what's going on abroad and in order to study specific cases?
Well, in an ideal world, I think as people at the IRS have told us, secrecy jurisdictions, also known as tax havens, are problematic because they have legal barriers that prevent groups like the IRS from getting information.
What was your goal in releasing that data? What was the goal?
Our goal at ICIJ, and mine personally in being part of the Panama Papers, was telling stories based on the information that would demonstrate that a system that should be working for the benefit of all is in fact working primarily for the interests of a very small minority of people on this planet. What happens now after Panama Papers, and I think we're seeing this, is that governments take up what journalists have now reported on, and they're the ones who have the power to introduce laws, to go after those who've broken laws, and to make the fundamental change that means there'll be fewer leaks for us to report on in the future.
You know, we were discussing earlier at the beginning of the interview, one of the main reasons why you're in Beirut was because you were invited to attend and talk about the Panama Papers at the Free Connected Minds conference, part of the May Chidiac Foundation, its yearly conference. And one of the other panels there that I had the pleasure to conduct was with WikiLeaks co-founder and editor-in-chief Julian Assange, which you attended a little bit. And the night before the panel, it's not out of the ordinary for an interviewer and an interviewee to discuss a few subjects and a few topics. And we were on the phone, and he actually asked what panel was right before the WikiLeaks one, and I said the Panama Papers. And then we started talking, and I know the ICIJ and WikiLeaks don't see eye to eye on how to conduct leakage, as you know, we can say. He says you've been very critical because the ICIJ head, Gerard Ryle, said, "We don't publish," and I quote, "all the documents. We try to give journalism, we try to reclaim ground for journalism. We are the alternative to WikiLeaks out there. This is a different model. We are probably a threat to WikiLeaks, and we're trying to show that journalism can be done responsibly." So in a way, that is an outright critique to WikiLeaks, because WikiLeaks has said, you know, how could they not release everything? Why are they withholding information, whereas WikiLeaks tends to release everything? So are they in competition? Is that what it is? How does that work?
I don't think it's a question of competition. I think
he did say we are the alternative, though.
Right.
The head
and
of the
I think
ICIJ.
this is where journalists are, and indeed where civil society is at this stage when it comes to journalism, and especially to leak-based journalism. We have to remember that leaks have really only been around for, as we know them, since really WikiLeaks 10 years ago.
The Pentagon Papers.
I'm talking in a digital sense.
Oh, right, in recent history.
Exactly,
right.
And therefore I think that journalists are still trying to work out, how do we process this information? How do we make sure that we're doing our job as tellers of fact, and we're doing it responsibly with all the technical and professional challenges that that entails? And therefore, it's not just a binary between WikiLeaks and ICIJ. There's a great debate going on across the globe these days
about how to handle leaks in general.
About how to handle this kind of information. Absolutely.
Right, but when he says, you know, we're trying to show that journalism can be done responsibly. I mean, obviously he's, you know, Julian Assange has gotten a lot of heat because of his leaks and because of, you know, not withholding information. But not withholding information is irresponsible because?
I would say that all journalists clearly strive towards responsibility.
But, you know, part of the reason why you are releasing these leaks, the Panama leaks, is for transparency, right? To hold people accountable, to make people aware, everyday people, that this is what's going on in your government, in your country. So how is it different? Because the goal is kind of the same, isn't it? The two goals are the same.
Indeed. Both organisations are interested in transparency. ICIJ and its members made a decision based on the Panama Papers that we were lucky enough to work on, and other decisions will be made by other organisations. The Panama Papers model, for example, is one that very much reflects what we see in government registries across the globe. We released over 200,000 names of shell companies and people associated with those companies, and that we know has been used by governments and is still being used by governments to go after individuals, to go after companies who perhaps have broken laws or avoided taxes.
Well, when people tell you, you know, ICIJ now, you know, one of the headquarters in DC, it has journalists obviously working in different countries, you know, and for it to be working that way, there has to be some form of government approval. When people tell you that, what do you respond to them?
I laugh and remind myself of the fact that probably the very first searches we all made when we had access to Panama Papers were Americans and American politicians and senior American figures, because the holy grail of that, the holy grail for a journalist working in America would be a great American story.
Right, but then if you were to criticize the system, you'd probably get heat for it as well.
I'm sure we would, and I'm sure we would welcome that heat from within the United States. As you said, our model is one of such global newsroom nature that I feel extremely confident in the fact that Panama Papers have been poured over by now over 400 very talented professional journalists.
What's the next thing you're going to work on? Or will we be releasing more papers of tax havens and offshore holdings? And
I think we live in a world, as the whistleblower of Panama Papers says, that is increasingly digitized, and therefore it wouldn't surprise me.
We don't
one
know who
bit.
he is or who she
We don't
is
know
or
who
what
he or she
source.
is.
All right.
But I'm not making any promises and have no information to base this off, but I'd be very surprised if we didn't see more leaks of this kind in the future.
When it comes to tax havens specifically, or different kinds of leaks?
I think all kinds of leaks.
Do you think there's a red line when it comes to leaks? There's some things that just should not be published, some things that should not be put out there?
I think I'd have to make that decision based on the content of the material. But given how widespread the scandals of the offshore industry and the finance industry are, I very much personally am looking forward to doing more of these kinds of investigations, because the problem isn't going away.
All right. Well, thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
That was Will Fitzgibbon, a reporter for the ICIJ. Thank you for tuning in.